The classroom fell silent as Barron Trump walked through the door, his usual calm demeanor intact. Mr. Anderson, standing at the front of the room, paused for a moment, then cracked a sly smile. "Ah, Barron, must be nice to have such a famous last name," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must make school so much easier for you, huh?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Some students looked down, others glanced at each other, and a few chuckled nervously. Barron's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, the eyes of his classmates now firmly fixed on him. The words stung, designed to provoke and humiliate him in front of everyone. Barron remained silent, gripping his books tighter. His usual calm was tested, and though his chest tightened, he didn't respond. He simply sat down, his heart racing, the weight of the moment settling deep inside him. The class waited, unsure whether Barron would fight back or let the moment pass, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Barron sat at his desk, trying desperately to ignore the stares of his classmates. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white, his eyes trained on the textbook in front of him. But no matter how hard he tried, Mr. Anderson's words echoed in his mind like a constant drumbeat, relentless and impossible to escape. "Must make school so much easier for you, huh?" The teacher's voice played in Barron's head again, over and over. The words felt like a punch, meant to knock him down in front of everyone. Barron had been the quiet student, the one who kept to himself, never seeking attention. But now, in this moment, he was the focus of the room. His classmates, some with smirks, others with sympathetic eyes, watched him, waiting for something, unsure of how to react. Barron tried to focus on the lesson in front of him, the words on the page swimming as he struggled to block out the memory of Mr. Anderson's mocking tone. He wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, to push the humiliation to the back of his mind and get back to the routine of the class. But it was impossible. The weight of the moment felt like it had wrapped itself around him, squeezing tighter with every passing second. His classmates' eyes were on him, some whispering, others exchanging knowing glances. Barron could hear their faint murmurs, the quiet laughter, the way they spoke as if he couldn't hear. The words were subtle, but they were there. Comments about his family, about the name he carried. It was all so much to handle, and Barron's chest tightened with a mix of anger and frustration. He wasn't like them. He didn't want this life, this spotlight. He just wanted to be normal. He glanced around the room, his gaze flickering across the faces of his peers. Some looked uncomfortable, unsure how to react, while others seemed to find amusement in his discomfort. He could feel the divide in the room. Some students were empathetic, quietly rooting for him to stand up for himself, while others seemed to enjoy the tension, watching the situation unfold like a show. The mixed reactions made the whole experience feel even worse, like he was being pulled in two directions at once. Barron's heart raced. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, to tell Mr. Anderson that he had crossed a line. But the thought of making things worse, of escalating the situation, made him hesitate. He didn't want to be the center of attention anymore. He didn't want to be the subject of ridicule. The quiet part of him, the part that had always kept to himself, urged him to stay silent, to let it go. But the sting of humiliation cut deep, and he could feel his emotions bubbling just under the surface, ready to spill over. For the first time in a long while, Barron felt small. The classroom, once a place where he could hide in plain sight, now felt like a stage, and he was the unwilling performer. The unease in the room settled around him like a cloud, and he knew the tension wouldn't disappear until something changed. Barron wished he could just disappear, to escape this moment, but he couldn't. The eyes of his classmates were still on him, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. And all Barron could do was sit there, trying to hold it together, knowing that the next few seconds might define how the rest of this day would unfold. The moment stretched, each second like an eternity. Barron could feel the weight of the entire classroom bearing down on him, the eyes of his peers heavy with anticipation. The sting of Mr. Anderson's words still burned in his chest, but now there was something else, something deeper. It wasn't just about the mocking comment anymore. It was about respect. It was about standing up for himself in a moment that demanded more than just silence. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, and Barron couldn't hold it in any longer. Mr. Anderson had just made another dig. A remark that was meant to embarrass Barron, to poke fun at him in front of everyone. The teacher's tone, dripping with sarcasm, cut through the air. "I guess it's easy for you to get by in this class with all the attention your family brings," he sneered, his voice rising slightly, pushing the boundary even further. The laughter that followed from a few of Barron's classmates stung, but it was the whispers that followed that made the pressure in his chest unbearable. Barron's hands tightened on the desk, the wood rough against his palms. His breath hitched in his throat as he glanced around the room, his classmates' eyes now shifting between him and Mr. Anderson, a mixture of curiosity and judgment swirling in the air. It felt like the world was closing in, like the walls of the classroom were shrinking. The murmurs grew louder, the uncomfortable energy swirling into something almost palpable. But then, Barron's silence broke. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed himself to his feet. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what he would do. Barron's heart raced, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but he was hurt, deeply hurt, and it was no longer something he could hide. He turned toward Mr. Anderson, his voice quiet but steady. "Is this how you treat all your students, or just me?" Barron's question cut through the thick silence, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. His voice didn't waver, and the clarity in it was sharp, cutting through the mockery like a blade. The room went completely still. The whispers stopped. Even the faint shuffle of papers in the back of the room ceased. Everyone, from the students to the teacher, was caught in that moment, held by the simple power of Barron's words. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an outburst. It was calm, controlled, but undeniable in its weight. Mr. Anderson's expression faltered for a split second. His usual arrogance, the smugness with which he had thrown his words, wavered. Barron had caught him off guard. For the first time, the teacher looked uncertain, unsure of how to respond. The room, once filled with the uncomfortable hum of tension, now felt eerily quiet. Barron's classmates, who had once eyed him with indifference or sympathy, now looked at him with something else: respect. His poised response was unlike anything they had expected. He wasn't simply defending himself. He was calling out the teacher's behavior, standing up against authority with a maturity far beyond his years. His emotions were raw, yet his restraint was powerful. As Barron stood there holding his ground, the entire classroom seemed to shift. The power had moved from Mr. Anderson to him. The atmosphere, once heavy with mockery, now felt charged with something different, something almost reverent. The silence was deafening. Barron had made his point, and in that moment, he knew it wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about showing everyone in that room the strength of standing up for oneself, no matter who was on the other side. The room was still, the silence pressing down like a heavy blanket. Barron's words hung in the air, their power undeniable. Mr. Anderson, visibly shaken, seemed to struggle for a moment, the once confident teacher suddenly uncertain. His mouth opened, then closed again, as if he were searching for something to say, anything to regain control of the situation. But no words came. The authority he once commanded in the classroom seemed to falter, and in that single moment, Barron had shifted the entire dynamic. The students, who had been tense and unsure of how to respond, now shifted in their seats. Some looked at Barron with new eyes, eyes full of respect, admiration even, while others, who had once laughed or whispered, now sat in hushed silence. The energy in the room had changed. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into something else entirely. Barron wasn't just a student anymore. He was a symbol of something much bigger, a quiet force of resilience and self-respect. Barron stood tall, his shoulders back, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't angry, but his quiet defiance spoke volumes. His voice had been steady, calm, and measured. Not a shout or a confrontation, but a clear statement of dignity. He wasn't going to let Mr. Anderson's mockery go unchallenged, and in that moment, he made it clear that respect wasn't something to be earned based on family name or status. It was something to be demanded in every situation. Barron wasn't asking for permission to stand up for himself. He was simply asserting that he deserved to be treated with respect. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Barron's breath, and the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. The class was holding its breath, as if waiting for the next move. Mr. Anderson, still processing the unexpected challenge, cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to push past the moment. He muttered something about continuing with the lesson, but the words felt hollow, lost in the weight of the silence that followed Barron's bold question. Barron didn't back down. He didn't feel the need to say anything more. He had already made his point. His calm presence, his controlled response had spoken louder than any words could. The teacher had failed to break him, and the students, some who had mocked him, some who had simply watched in discomfort, were beginning to see Barron in a new light. The quiet boy who had been a figure in the back of the room was now someone who commanded respect, someone who had the courage to stand up for himself when it mattered most. The classroom seemed to exhale collectively, the tension that had once gripped it now slowly dissipating. A few students began to nod in quiet agreement, and some exchanged glances, a subtle acknowledgement of Barron's strength. They realized that it wasn't about arguing or fighting. It was about confidence, control, and the courage to speak up when others would have stayed silent. Barron remained standing, his posture steady, his gaze still fixed on the teacher. There was no need for applause or grand gestures. This was simply a quiet victory. In the silence, Barron had done something far more powerful than anyone had expected. He had reminded them all of the power of self-respect and the strength it takes to stand firm in the face of adversity. The teacher, once the center of authority in the room, was now just another person trying to regain the ground he had lost. And Barron, in that moment, had claimed a victory, not over Mr. Anderson, but over the forces of humiliation and disrespect. The bell rang, but it felt like a lifetime before the classroom began to stir again. The students, still holding the weight of Barron's words in the air, slowly shifted in their seats, unsure of what to do next. The tension that had once hung thickly between Barron and Mr. Anderson now felt like a distant memory. A weight lifted from the room. Barron sat quietly at his desk, his gaze steady and calm, yet the storm that had raged in his chest was beginning to settle. He hadn't won anything by speaking up. There had been no applause, no grand gesture. But in that silence, in that simple act of standing his ground, Barron had gained something more profound than any applause could offer: the respect of his peers. As the class emptied out, the usual hustle and bustle of students heading to their next period seemed to pause around Barron. A few students lingered, hesitating for a moment before approaching him. At first, Barron thought they were simply going to offer him sympathy, but as the first student nodded at him, their eyes meeting in mutual understanding, Barron realized that something had shifted. It wasn't just pity or words of comfort. They were looking at him with genuine admiration. "You handled that really well," one of the boys said, his voice low but sincere. Barron met his gaze, nodding quietly, the faintest flicker of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He hadn't expected this, hadn't thought about what would come next. But the respect in the boy's eyes said it all. Another girl, who had been one of the more sympathetic faces during the exchange, approached him as well. "I didn't think you were going to say anything, but when you did, it was like you put us all in our place," she said softly, her words full of admiration. That was really brave. Barron's heart swelled, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't seeking validation, but hearing these words, quiet, genuine, unspoken before, made him feel like something had changed. Barron had been the quiet student in the corner, the one who didn't seek the limelight. But today, his actions had spoken louder than any words could. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't yelled, but in that calm, controlled moment, he had said everything that needed to be said, and the students around him had felt it. What had begun as a moment of humiliation for Barron had transformed into a moment of quiet strength, and the ripple effect of that moment was something even Barron hadn't fully anticipated. As the students filtered out, Barron remained seated for a moment longer. The quiet satisfaction that settled in his chest was more than he could have hoped for. There was no need for a pat on the back, no need for anyone to make him feel better. He had made his point. His simple act of standing up for himself had changed the energy of the entire room. The teacher, once the embodiment of authority, had been left struggling to regain control, while Barron, with nothing more than his words and his composure, had earned something far greater: his peers' respect. He didn't seek validation. That wasn't why he spoke up. But Barron knew, as he sat there in the now empty classroom, that his actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. His classmates would never forget what had happened today. The way he had handled adversity with grace, the way he had stood firm in the face of humiliation. Barron didn't need anyone to tell him he was strong. He already knew. By the time the last bell rang, the halls of the school were alive with whispers. Barron had no idea how fast the story had spread, but the energy around him was undeniable. The usual chatter of students rushing out of classrooms had been replaced with hushed conversations, eyes flicking to him as he walked through the hallways. It was a strange feeling, something he'd never experienced before. He'd been the quiet kid, the one who stayed under the radar, never looking for attention. But now, as he passed by groups of students, he noticed the change in their expressions. It wasn't pity or sympathy. It was something else. Something that, for the first time in his life, felt like respect. The whispers weren't about his family, the name he carried, or his connection to anyone else. They were about him. Barron Trump, the boy who had stood up for himself when others would have backed down. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate with anger. But his words, simple yet powerful, had reached something inside his peers that none of the typical schoolyard antics ever could. As Barron walked down the corridor, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The students who had once avoided eye contact or barely acknowledged his presence were now looking at him with newfound admiration. They weren't seeing him through the lens of his last name or his family anymore. They were seeing Barron, the person, the one who had quietly and confidently stood up to authority when it mattered. It wasn't long before word of Barron's response reached the principal's office. Mrs. Hargrove, the school principal, had been in meetings all afternoon. But as soon as she heard what had happened, she called for Barron to come to her office. Barron walked in, a little nervous, unsure of what to expect. He had never been summoned to the principal's office for anything good, but the calmness in her voice put him at ease. "Barron, thank you for coming in," Mrs. Hargrove said as she motioned for him to sit. She smiled warmly at him before continuing. "I've heard what happened in your history class today, and I wanted to personally commend you for how you handled the situation." Barron blinked, unsure if she was talking to him. "I just said what I felt," he replied quietly. "I know," Mrs. Hargrove said, leaning forward slightly. "That's what makes it so impressive. You stood up for yourself in a way that most adults would struggle to do, and you did it with maturity and poise." Barron's chest swelled with a mix of pride and humility. He hadn't expected praise, especially not from someone like Mrs. Hargrove, but her words made him feel like his actions had mattered. She continued, "I've also spoken with Mr. Anderson about the situation. His behavior was completely unacceptable, and I assure you that it will be addressed." Barron nodded, feeling a weight lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't been sure what kind of fallout there would be from speaking up. He hadn't even done it for recognition. He had just wanted to make it clear that he wouldn't tolerate disrespect. To hear that the principal was taking the matter seriously made him feel like his voice had been heard, not just by his peers, but by the adults who had the power to make sure such things didn't happen again. As Barron left Mrs. Hargrove's office, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in just a few hours. The respect he had gained from his classmates felt genuine, not just because of his family name, but because of how he had handled the situation with dignity. He wasn't the quiet son of a prominent family anymore. He was Barron, a young man who commanded respect because of his strength, his courage to stand up for what was right, and his ability to remain calm in the face of adversity. The news continued to spread, not just among students but also among teachers and staff. They too began to see Barron differently. He had shown them all that standing up for yourself didn't require anger or confrontation. Sometimes it simply took speaking the truth and having the courage to hold your ground. And Barron had done that with such quiet grace that his actions left a mark on everyone who witnessed them. It was a lesson not just for the students who had seen it firsthand, but for the entire school. The real power lay in the ability to speak up when it mattered most, without compromising your integrity. Barron had given them all that lesson in a single quiet moment. As Barron walked through the hallways the next day, the air felt different. The usual noise of lockers slamming and students rushing to their next class was quieter, as if the entire school was holding its breath, waiting for something. Barron moved through the crowds of students, and it didn't take long for him to realize that the whispers following him weren't like the ones from before. They weren't mocking or teasing. They were quiet, respectful murmurs, words exchanged in hushed tones. He could hear his name occasionally, but now it wasn't followed by ridicule. Instead, it was followed by admiration. Barron kept his head high, but there was a quiet weight in his chest. This wasn't the attention he had sought. He hadn't wanted this to be a spectacle, but in the wake of his stand against Mr. Anderson, something had changed, not just in the way the students saw him, but in how they saw themselves. The way people looked at Barron was different now. They no longer saw the son of a famous family. They saw a young man who had stood up for himself when it mattered most, who had faced humiliation head-on and responded with grace, with dignity, and with strength. As he passed groups of students, he could feel their eyes on him, but there was no judgment in them now. Instead, there was an unspoken respect. It wasn't just about the words Barron had spoken in that classroom. It was about the way he had carried himself afterward. He had faced something painful, something meant to break him, and yet he had turned it into something empowering, something that had made him stronger. Barron didn't walk with arrogance, but there was a quiet confidence in his steps that hadn't been there before. A girl from his history class approached him between periods. She was someone who had sat quietly in the back during the lesson, never engaging much with Barron. She had witnessed the whole interaction, and now, standing in front of him, she had a softness in her eyes. "I just wanted to say, what you did yesterday was really brave," she said, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. Barron nodded, unsure of how to respond, but a warmth spread through him at her words. "Thanks," he said simply, feeling the heat of his own gratitude for the quiet recognition. She smiled softly and walked away, leaving Barron standing there, feeling a deep shift inside. It wasn't about this one moment or about making headlines. Barron's response to Mr. Anderson wasn't designed to win anyone over, yet it had done just that. It wasn't loud or flashy. It wasn't a heroic gesture in the traditional sense. Barron had simply shown up, been present, and reacted with the kind of strength that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It was a quiet strength, the kind that defined his character. The longer Barron walked the halls, the more he realized that this was something far bigger than a single event. It wasn't just about proving a point to his teacher. It was about showing his classmates, the people around him, that standing up for yourself didn't require aggression. It required courage, integrity, and the resolve to remain true to yourself even when the world might try to break you. Barron had given them all a lesson, not just in standing up to authority, but in standing up for their own self-respect. As he settled back into his routine, Barron noticed that the shift wasn't just in how others treated him, it was in how they treated each other. There was a new sense of unity in the air, an unspoken understanding that strength didn't come from dominance or intimidation, but from quiet resolve and the courage to be true to who you are. It was the legacy of Barron's quiet moment of courage, a legacy that would stay with the school long after the echoes of his words faded. The days following the incident felt surreal for Barron. It wasn't just the attention he received from students and teachers alike, but the deep sense of reflection that seemed to settle over the entire school. Word had spread quickly, and what had initially been a moment of discomfort had now transformed into something profound, something bigger than Barron could have anticipated. It wasn't about winning the argument or making a point. It was about showing up, standing tall, and handling adversity with the kind of quiet dignity that changed the way others viewed him. As Barron moved through the school halls, he noticed a subtle shift in the way his classmates interacted. There were no longer whispers or sidelong glances. Instead, there was a quiet respect in their eyes. It wasn't the kind of respect that came from fear or admiration for his family. It was respect earned through his actions, through the way he had remained calm in the face of mockery, the way he had stood up for himself without raising his voice, without aggression. His simple, composed response had shown everyone that strength doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It doesn't have to come from confrontation or anger. It comes from standing firm in your beliefs, from refusing to let others diminish your worth. The teachers, too, were reflecting on what had happened. Some came to Barron privately to express their admiration for the way he had handled the situation. Others, like Mrs. Hargrove, the principal, had addressed the incident in a school-wide meeting, speaking about respect, integrity, and how easily authority could be misused. The incident had made them all think about the power they held, about the responsibility they carried in shaping young minds. Barron had unwittingly reminded them of something important. True authority isn't about wielding power. It's about how you use that power to uplift others, to guide them with respect. Barron, for his part, never sought recognition for his actions. He didn't want to be seen as a hero or a martyr. In his eyes, he had simply done what anyone in his position should have done. He had spoken up when it mattered most. The feeling of respect from his peers and teachers was nice, but that wasn't the point. For Barron, the most important lesson wasn't about silencing Mr. Anderson, the teacher who had humiliated him. It was about maintaining his integrity, holding his ground, and not letting the actions of others change who he was. It was about showing that true strength lies in how you respond to life's challenges, not in how you let them break you. The ripple effect of Barron's courage continued long after the incident. It wasn't just Barron who had learned something from this experience. It was everyone around him. His classmates began to treat each other with more kindness, more empathy, and more respect. They saw that it was okay to stand up for themselves, to speak their truth, and to treat others with dignity, no matter their status or their background. Barron's quiet defiance had sparked something inside them. A realization that standing up for what's right wasn't about making noise, but about making an impact with your actions. Barron never asked for this lesson to be his, but as he walked through the hallways, with his head held high and his heart calm, he knew that he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for the entire school. He had shown them that the true measure of strength doesn't come from shouting the loudest or having the most power. It comes from handling adversity with grace, from choosing to be respectful even when faced with disrespect, and from remaining true to yourself, no matter what. For Barron, that was the real victory. The victory that stayed with him long after the whispers had faded. If Barron's story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Have you ever stood up for yourself or someone else in a moment when it really mattered? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories of courage and self-respect. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of quiet strength, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the impact we can all make. Let's keep spreading positivity and courage together.